Yes, sorry. Thank you so
Yeah,
much for
great.
that warm welcome. And indeed, thank you for the opportunity to be here among such a distinguished group of speakers. I'm humbled by it, but also indeed very happy to take up that challenge to actually respond to your request and an invitation to talk about minority inclusive World Heritage interpretation today. I've added a subtitle to that towards a balanced approach. I think we have a number of lessons that we can draw from the current situation, and that may also allow for reflections for the current, present, and the future about this topic. So let me start. And indeed, once again, thank you to the Preparatory Office for the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentation of World Heritage Sites to indeed draw attention to this important dimension. I think it's a crucial one, and I will hope that I'm sure that many in the audience will also agree to me that we need to address this even more than we're doing right now. So I think it's an excellent space for critical thinking and timing, and of course, in today's bigger political climate, we might say that minority matters matter. It's a wake-up call in the heritage field. We see numerous discussions taking place about what has been going on, recent events revealing that we have deep heritage legacies, numerous social discontents, as well as deep-running social inequalities, forms of violence, and hierarchies of voice. And these aren't necessarily new topics for the heritage field, but they're increasingly pressingly important and part of current debates. So minority connections, we might say, they matter in different ways. And some of the key points in this respect are indeed the need to question current ideas often found in the heritage field of minorities as the exotic other, ideas of racialized difference, and in some respects, we cannot continue heritage as usual. So on the flip side of that is really thinking about heritage complexity and richness, and perhaps rethinking the way we think about that complexity and richness. And part of that, I think, connects us very much to that broader field of representation and interpretation. How do we actually rethink contemporary representations and what I would call rewrite? And here at the double play on writing and rights, rewrite forms of minority agency and subjects of decision making, rather than just consider minorities as objects of heritage making. So, but let's turn a bit broader, kind of zoom out a bit and think about what happens when minorities meet world heritage, and indeed what happens when heritage systems meet minorities. And within that, what is the role for interpretation? And what's the particular role for minority inclusive interpretation? And how should we actually consider, would we define that given the current context? But first of all, what do we actually mean by minorities? And that's not an easy, there's no easy answer to that. Indeed, there's no simple international definition we can rely on. And I would just here refer to a recent working definition by the UN Special Rapporteur on minorities, Fernand Varenne, who speaks about ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities as any group of persons that constitute less than half of the population in the entire territory of a state, whose members share common characteristics of culture, religion, or language, or a combination of these. A person can freely belong to an ethnic, religious, or linguistic minority without any requirement of citizenship, residence, official recognition, or any other status. And I've chosen to put that in bold because, of course, we're dealing with forms of identity that are at times contested and at times not necessarily recognized by the given nation state, but that indeed, from the perspective of international human rights standards, that is not necessarily a requirement. Indeed, the issue here of self-identification is important, and I think that's important also when we talk about minority dynamics within the World Heritage System. It also belongs to the international system. I would also like to add to that definition, perhaps, for the matter of our discussion here and the heritage field, gender minorities, minorities with other sexual orientations, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex. In order to indeed emphasize this also as a critical dimension when we think about minorities in the heritage field. So I think here, the spirit here, and indeed this refers to dynamics also raised by Bill Logan and others in the previous presentations, is that of social inclusivity. And in this respect, once again here, the heritage field has a lot to offer. And indeed, I think this is also why I would encourage thinking of this as an inclusive approach, that also referring to the first conversation I mentioned, that we're not stuck in sort of the conflictive dimensions of definitional issue here, but we're open and try to be inclusive. Because indeed, even if we might say ethnic minorities in general are omnipresent all over the world, they're fairly invisible in the World Heritage sphere. I'm not saying they're completely invisible. As I'll come back to in a couple of moments, there are different ways that minorities are visibilized, but that is also a matter of discussion. But I think the crucial thing here is that we're talking about, obviously, people that can be found anywhere in the world. If you look at the kind of inclusive definitions that I've just encouraged us to think about in the World Heritage context. For example, minorities are clearly part of urban fabrics all over the world, religion, ethnicity, and it has huge important dynamics also in relation to spatial organization, but of course also matters of social stratification. We also see all over the world cases of multi-layered heritage sites that abound with indeed contested memories. Here's an emblematic case we've seen from India, for example, with the whole sort of process that was about reconstructing a temple in a case that had also been the site of a mosque that had been destroyed, I think back in 1902. So this is really part of reality all over the world. Heritage sites involving multi-layered perspectives, very often involving minority perspectives. And this made me think of the importance of really trying to sort of acknowledge and identify the multiplicity of minority heritage dynamics. And this is far from being exhaustive, but I wanted to just show the kinds of diversity of minority heritage dynamics that we see all over the world. For example, if we start from above, we have cases where minority heritage is directly targeted for destruction, deliberate destruction, targeting of ethnic minorities, even criminalization of minority heritage, and so on. Languages prohibited. So we've seen major cases with the Rohingya in Myanmar, for example, that where also the whole massive movements of people to flee the situation was also accompanied by deliberate destruction of heritage sites. We, of course, also have numerous cases where it's not a matter of just heritage being targeted, but indeed minorities themselves persecuted, as we just talked about, but even identities being perceived as a threat to the narratives or to the ideas of the particular nation state. And we've seen this with LGBTQ, but also in other cases. So I think it's important to acknowledge that this is one kind of minority heritage dynamic, and it's important to acknowledge that also because it indeed points to the high levels of potential conflict also that may be produced, and vice versa, the potential of heritage processes as peace-building dynamics. So this is something that we've addressed in a number of contexts, and I think something that urgently deserves much more attention. It's not as if the global dynamics currently are just oriented towards peace, and we have highly polarized dynamics in several contexts. Another dynamic of a minority heritage dynamics is that of invisibility. We've seen that in a numerous World Heritage contexts where minority heritage is part of the social cultural fabric, yet virtually invisible in terms of how the outstanding universal values are identified, in terms of how that heritage is being managed. Now, what happens in those kinds of invisibility, of course, depends on specific context, but we often see what we might consider collateral damage, basically having no conducive conditions to actually support ethnic minority stewards in taking up and working towards protecting their heritage. So in a sense, this may also lead to decay, lead to heritage loss. Indeed, that whole idea of ethnic minority heritage as living heritage suffers also in these kinds of invisibilized conditions. What's also interesting, of course, is that we increasingly see what I would call forms of partial recognition of minority heritage. In many countries, indeed, there's increasing emphasis on seeing minority heritage as part of what we might label the national heritage mosaic. Some kind of recognition that this is also part of the bigger cultural picture. And that we see in quite a few number of cases with different associated dynamics. Some of it is also considered as problematic. There are risks of this being of ethnic minority heritage or other minority heritage being reduced to matters of folklore. It's being reified, freezed in a certain way, and in many cases even commodified objects to trade in the market arena. And then I would say, lastly, there's also growing rights-based recognition of minority heritage, where indeed increasingly it's also about heritage as a tool for asserting collective rights, asserting identity recognition, and also reworking relationships with the nation state. And in this respect, we might also say that there's a growing space within the World Heritage field to acknowledge human rights-based approaches. And indeed, there's a whole and very important discussion to have about how minority rights can offer a framework for reworking minority heritage dynamics in the World Heritage arena. So I just want to give you that broader sort of set of arrangements, because it's not necessarily that they're all separate, but they certainly helps us to draw attention to different dynamics involved. Indeed, I would say that we also have a huge question of dynamics of polarization, conflict, and destruction taking place. Here is, of course, indeed a case, and this may range from the targeting of minority heritage to also World Heritage being targeted. We have a number of cases where heritage, in a sense, is being drawn into a crossfire. And I might actually say here that heritage and minorities are easy targets for extremism and easy targets for being drawn into conflicts. So this is obviously something that should immediately require that there is concerted and structural attention to the matters of interpretation as well. Now, how does all that fit into the World Heritage arena? We've already touched a bit upon it through the earlier slides, but I would then say again that it can fit in many different ways, and what are indeed then the possibilities and the potential for the quality, for good quality inclusive interpretation. Well, obviously, if we start to the left, if we're dealing with situations of targeted destruction, opposition, even persecution of minorities, that is obviously not a very conducive context for inclusive interpretation, or the types of interpretation would seem very paradoxical faced in the broader context of extreme marginalization. If we move further on to the right, Indeed, when minorities are simply the commodified other, objects to be observed, sold, or even on a tourism path, that is not nor does that either open up for a very inclusive interpretation. There may be informed interpretation about minority concerns, histories, cultural histories, material histories, but it's not inclusive from a social perspective. In the case of invisibility, and here I have a picture of a site I've worked a lot in central Vietnam, where the OUV, I will get back to that as well, is based on natural values. Here, the ethnic minority heritage is fairly invisible, and that leaves a bit of a limbo in terms of actually having inclusive approaches and making the connection. As we move further to the right towards Mosaic recognition, we see multiple approaches actually indeed recognizing minority heritage, but the question is always on which conditions, whose voice, etc. I'll get back to that in a second. And finally, we have dynamics of inclusive interpretation that potentially are based on a framework of rights-based recognition, which as I will also discuss later, involves basically shifting minorities from being an object of heritage concern to being subjects of decision-making and thinking and agency in the heritage field. So we have that whole spectrum, and I think that that every site and every site manager will have reflections about how to think about this, and perhaps also rethink modalities of engagement and interpretation. Okay, so I would say as a start that the minority and world heritage relationship is an uneven one, and also potentially contradictory one, but also one that has scope for improvement and synergy building in certain contexts and under certain conditions, I would say. So let's look a bit into some cases and move forward. We have cases where ethnic minority culture is clearly a part of what has been defined as the outstanding universal value of given sites. Here, the old town of Lijiang, for example, which in its statement regarding the OUV for the site speaks about how this has resulted from cultural communication between groups such as the Naxi, the Han, Tibetan, and the Bai, involving social life, customs, arts, and crafts, etc. So in some respects, there are cases where indeed ethnic minority heritage is redefined as something that's of outstanding universal value. Now, we have other cases. Also, we have cases, for example, in the case of the Auschwitz and Birkenau, where the genocide is indeed important for understanding the OUV there in terms of the genocide of the Jews by the Nazi regime. And so in that sense, we have these cases where there's a clear link between minorities and the OUV. But then we also have cases, for example, where it's not so clear. So if we stick to the case of Auschwitz, for example, a number of people working on the intersection between LGBT and world heritage emphasize how that the site description of Auschwitz mainly refers to Jews, Roma, and the Sinti and other nationalities, but there's little reference, for example, to the persecution of homosexuals and the particularly degrading conditions that they faced. So in that sense, again, minority perspectives are somehow easily forgotten or left out. The case of Amsterdam, with a little vignette up in the top of the PowerPoint here, the OUV speaks of Amsterdam as a crucial center for intellectual exchange, dissemination of humanist thought. And then people have indeed also created what they call the Homo Monument to commemorate the persecution because of sexuality. So what becomes interesting is indeed that intersection or that connection between OUV and the particular historical experience, the lived experience, and the perspectives of minorities in different contexts. This is also important for natural heritage and cultural landscapes. Indeed, minorities are very much part of and live in areas that are sometimes defined as wilderness or considered cultural landscape, here from the Himalaya to the rice terraces of the Ifugao in the Cordillera in the Philippines and so on. Now, of course, I will not get into discussions on minorities and indigenous peoples here, but I do, of course, and that's also a kind of a shifting topic in the sense that indeed in a number of countries, the wording is used interchangeably, that certain ethnic minorities, for example, would qualify as indigenous peoples in international human rights language, and that raises a whole series of issues that I won't have time to get into here, but it's something to keep in mind. As I mentioned, indeed, in a number of natural contexts, these are deeply historically connected cultural landscapes that are easily silenced by the emphasis on natural, outstanding, universal values. And that has a whole series of implications, which we have dialogued quite a bit about also in some of the areas that I have worked in and I continue to work in, because it does raise a number of questions about how to deal with that coexistence of different values and the constant risk of minority values and perspectives to remain marginal in the bigger picture, which is constantly driven towards the emphasis on outstanding universal values. The point here is that there's nothing natural about that silence. There's nothing natural about the silence of minority perspectives on heritage. It's rather about social and cultural hierarchies of value, different layers of meaning, but also stratified ideas of identity. Some identities matter more than others, etc. So this is something that we need to get better at tackling head on, because it's exactly about the dynamics of exclusion and inclusion, and the role that heritage and world heritage play in that respect. So on the one hand, there is that risk of heritage designation and management, reproducing histories of marginalization, reproducing contentious politics, reproducing and even exacerbating the kinds of potential conflicts that might arise out of that. Remember that earlier slide about polarization. Is heritage actually intensifying that dynamic of polarization, or can heritage from the other perspective involve new forms of recognition, forms of inclusion that allow for actually reconciling these different perspectives? So this is a key question and key dynamic. And I'm very thankful for the opportunity to actually address this here, because what we do see, and I want to insist upon this, is that minorities continuously face the risk of eviction, displacement, and marginality, also in World Heritage dynamics. And why is that? You know, we have increasingly now had for many years matters of community inclusion, community voice, and so on. And so why does this risk continue to be there? And part of the answer, I think, is that we're talking about structural dynamics, societal dynamics that are, in a sense, much deeper and much more entrenched than the sort of aspirations we might see in emerging World Heritage language. So what happens is that we have processes of designation, processes of gentrification, management, even private sector capture of benefits and so on, that leave minorities in a marginal position very often. We also have legacy issues. So that means both legacy issues and ongoing realities of minorities that may face insecure tenure, security, insecure not very clear rights. I mean, we've seen a number of cases where even the citizenship of minorities has been contested in World Heritage Site planning processes. This was, for example, the case, I believe, in the Karen in a Thai site, where their actual citizenship of the country was thrown into question. In those cases, what we see then is that official narratives, unless there is a strong safeguard framework, risk reproducing marginality rather than enabling reconciliation. And in that sense, heritage, once again, despite our aspirations for something else, may risk deepening discrimination rather than promoting inclusion. Now, that being said, there's also space for change and new narratives. Indeed, the question is then, how do we do that, and under which conditions do we enable that to take place? So I would say presentation and interpretation have key roles to play in that respect. The question is how it's done, what is being done, for whom it's being done, and by whom it's being done. It's about balancing forms of recognition. So just for the case of simplicity here, think of three spheres interacting: minority heritage, minority rights, world heritage. We might speak of cases where there's a so-called minor imbalance. Indeed, where in the bigger picture, what's being focused on is world heritage, and minority heritage is considered minor heritage compared to the OUV. And the consequences we've seen very often is that minority heritage is neglected compared to national and universalist narratives. As a consequence of that, it's under prioritized and it's underfinanced. As a further consequence of that is heritage loss, no? So, I mean, despite all the statistics we now have from ethnohistorians, ethnolinguistics, about the drama, indeed a cultural crisis for certain minorities in terms of maintaining, sustaining, and reproducing culture, we actually see here the risk of World Heritage dynamics furthering another push towards undermining minority heritage in the long term. The positive, well, not the positive, but the issue here is that it's a lost opportunity. It's a lost opportunity to use the World Heritage Framework to indeed strengthen and engage with heritage stewards in finding alternative ways of going about that. A different scenario is that of, we might say, is the multicultural minority mosaic heritage framework, no? Where we have in some countries some form of heritage pluralism, where minority cultures are recognized, leading to a kind of national mosaic heritage framework. Now, what we've learned from literature here is that that very often involves top-down, fragmented, partial recognition only, and there's a lot of critique about it being depoliticized. The question is recognition of what and on whose premises, and at the end of the day, you might have minority heritage recognized, yet wider processes of minority exclusion taking place at the same time. So that leaves a bit of a paradoxical situation, but of course also a space for reform and improvement. Another framework would be again, we have these three circles here, is the growing space for minority rights. And this is an important space to think about. Indeed, it's very much also about nation-state frameworks within language of multiculturalism and rights are reforming constitutions, and in some places have tried to replace policies of assimilation with constitutional recognition and voice. So what we see there are growing rights spaces, legalized minority associations, collective action, allowing for their voice to be heard, very often accompanied by both substantive and procedural rights, also when it comes to heritage. Now, those processes may not always be very well connected with the heritage field, and that what we have seen very often is indeed the need for a sensitization of the rights field and sensitization of the heritage field actors to actually figure out how that will work within the complexity of things like World Heritage. Going down that line of talking about minority rights, one should of course also emphasize the 1992 UN Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic, Religious, or Linguistic Minorities, which states in Article 1 that states shall protect the existence and the national or ethnic, cultural, religious, and linguistic identity of minorities, encouraging conditions for the promotion of that identity. So it's very clear. This is a declaration. And we see that link here, of course, potential link between heritage and identity, which is even further emphasized, I would say, in Article 4, which speaks about state measures to create favorable conditions to enable persons belonging to minorities to express their characteristics and to develop their culture, language, religion, traditions, and customs. So this is all very good. And indeed, as we saw in 2005, when heads of state and government went at the World Summit of the United Nations General Assembly, came out with a statement indeed saying that the promotion and protection of the rights of persons belonging to national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities contributes to political and social stability and peace and enriches the cultural diversity and heritage of society. So the bigger political ambition, the global ambition is there. We have a declaration, we have these statements, we have this framework. Now, what does all this mean in the context of what I call WHIPIC, World Heritage Interpretation? Who, and I'm playing around with the WH letters here. So who is involved in WHIPIC? Which identities on which premises with what outcomes? No, and the bigger move here, which we've seen taking off in some cases, but needs further, I would say, policy framing in the World Heritage context, is that of taking minorities as objects of heritage making, expertise, and folklore towards being subjects, actors of identity, of decision making, and rights holders in the World Heritage process. So back to the initial question, what happens when minorities meet World Heritage? World Heritage system meets minorities. What role for interpretation in all of this? You might say, well, Peter, this is well beyond what we can actually do from our focus here on interpretation. And I would say indeed, well, wait a minute. Can't we reshape heritage making and think about inclusive reinterpretation as part of reconciliatory identity politics? I think it's absolutely essential. Heritage as a political process in that sense has a key role to play, and World Heritage and the UNESCO system at large, an even more important one in terms of the kinds of polarized politics and the marginal situation we see of minorities in so many countries. We have a choice to make, and I think it's important that we are conscious about those choices and that we really mobilize that strong ambition and will to action that we see in the heritage field. I would say that inclusive interpretation after this or during this process of Black Lives Matter is really a question about whether we are interested in enabling empowerment or we simply end up reproducing heritage as usual. Do we just play minority songs, or do we empower minority voice and participation in World Heritage? Do we simply enroll minorities as exotic stopovers on heritage tours, buy their artisanal products, or do we actually promote them as active stewards in management of their heritage and support their cultural identities? Is heritage reinforcing a folklore gaze, or does it try to actually help redress complex state minority histories, sometimes conflict, and move towards reconciliation? Now, interpretation, yes, has a role to play in this respect, but of course, we need to problematize what we mean by inclusiveness, inclusion, and we also need to look at how inclusive interpretation connects with underlying conditions. What heritage counts, whose voice counts, whose values, whose interpretation, which interconnections matter, what is presented. Indeed, as we've seen in this lecture series, as Neil Smith noted, there's little formal guidance on representation and interpretation in the World Heritage arena. Bill Logan also emphasized all of this as a matter of interpretation, meaning and values, political context, and different uses of heritage. We do see in the World Heritage operational guidelines then a double gap here. One is the gap in relation to interpretation, and the other is the gap in relation to minority rights. We have no direct reference to minorities in operational guidelines, while some progress has been made in terms of recognizing indigenous peoples and an emphasis on local communities. We have to acknowledge this as an important gap. Now, that being said, we do have the World Heritage and Sustainable Development Policy that calls for a cross-cultural sensitive approach to interpretation. And among other things, what's emphasized there is that the adoption of approaches to the interpretation of World Heritage properties that are of significance to various local communities and other stakeholders, particularly in the nomination process and when it involves managing heritage associated with conflicts. So here I think it's important that we acknowledge different rights holders and that process of acknowledgement as a vehicle for ensuring cross-cultural sensitivity. Indeed, if we're talking about cases of conflict, if we don't have that recognition, it's highly unlikely that that process can take place in an equitable way. So I think my time, I will leave some time open for discussion here and conclude in again, getting back to what I would say, the importance of rewriting heritage as a basis for minority inclusive World Heritage interpretation. We need to acknowledge minorities as distinct right holders that have particular perspectives on heritage. We need to acknowledge that this involves different values, different narratives, matters of representation, but that it also concerns governance and resources. Notably, once we think about governance dynamics in relation to how management systems are put in place, whose voice matters, and how to actually create mechanisms that genuinely engage with minorities as a matter of good faith. And for that to happen, inclusion will require that approaches to interpretation that acknowledge and sort of build on, but also try to work out of wider processes of exclusion. So that whole reflection process fundamentally for inclusive minority heritage or minority inclusive World Heritage to take place, for that to be reconciliatory, we'll have to have a strong emphasis on empowerment and allowing for voice. So to finish about this idea of rewriting, it's not just about rewriting the contents in terms of heritage interpretation and presentation. It's also about rewriting the forms, the mechanisms, and the effects. What is being said, through which means, and with what consequences. So I think I will basically stop here and open up for discussion. And thank you again for the opportunity, indeed, to be able to undertake this presentation as part of the lecture series. Thank you very much.